Okay. All right. So this is lecture 6. It is not on exam 1. Okay. This will be on exam 2. In an ideal world, we wouldn't really go into this until you've already had exam 1. However, lab next week will be on exam 1. And then I won't be here. Our TA won't be here, so we can't have the quiz or the exam next week. Okay. So we're doing it on the 10th. Any questions about the announcement I posted? Did all that stuff make sense on the changes we're making? Okay. After exam 1, we should be back on track. Okay. All right. Today, we're going to start honing in on the stalker industry. Okay. We're going to talk about the importance of the stalker sector. Okay. And what services they have. There's really 3 main services that the stalker industry fills for the wider beef industry. Okay. Okay. Learning objective. So I want you to understand the economic roles or the services that the stalker/backgrounder sector fills. Okay. These are production role, inventory role, and then market balancing role. And all these are from Darrell Peel. He's kind of a famous beef extension economist, ag economist at Oklahoma State. Okay. All these are from his paper in 2003. Okay. So what are the consequences of not growing a beef animal prior to putting them on a full finisher diet? We'll talk about that today. We'll go more in depth on those consequences later. And then I want you to be able to describe the relationship between stalker value of gain and feedlot cost of gain. Does anyone have a suspicion of what that relationship might look like? Feedlot cost of gain versus stalker value of gain. What would you suspect that would look like? Do you think the value of a animal coming off pasture, that's grown on pasture, would be higher or lower when feedlot cost of gain is low? Yep, lower, absolutely. So in times when the feedlot cost of gain is high, the value of gain for stalker cattle is also high. They want to incentivize cattle being grown outside of a confinement, okay, so that they can be placed into a feedlot and finished over a shorter period of time. Because that cost of gain, really, that corn price is so much higher. So it costs more money to feed them. So today, we're in a situation where corn prices are relatively low. Cost of gain in a feedlot is relatively low, okay? And feeder inventory is at a historical low, right? So supply of feeder cattle to be placed into a feedlot is really low. What would we suspect the value of gain in a stalker operation to look like? Pretty low, okay? So there's not much place in the current beef industry for a stalker operation today. That doesn't mean people aren't putting cattle on wheat pasture, right? Or aren't going to graze them in the Flint Hills of Kansas. But the incentive to do that is much less. Okay? Does that make sense? So these markets all kind of feed into each other. Okay? All right. So U.S. supply of stalker cattle impacts feedlot operations, impacts stalker operations, the cost of gain, growth potential of calves, and grain prices all have an impact on the stalker system and the feedlot system. And then the stalker system impacts the feedlot system. So all these things kind of balance and they dictate where cattle are going to go, whether they're going to be grown on pasture or grown in a feedlot. Does that make sense? Okay. Benefits of a stalker. So increasing age, increasing weight. The older and heavier an animal is, when it gets placed into a feedlot, lower incidence of death loss and morbidity that's going to occur. So the incidence of sickness will be less. Increasing uniformity of the cattle and the quality of the cattle. So can we get multiple groups of cattle, group them by likeness, add frame to small frame cattle, and then sell them, increase the value of those animals in the stocker system. Okay. Feedlot facilities may not fit smaller cattle. Okay. Maybe they won't flow as well through the snake to go to their squeeze chute. Maybe the snake is so wide they'll be able to turn around and cause problems in processing. Okay. And then this holds true today. Okay, this is from 1987. Okay, but it still holds true today. The vast majority of cattle marketed in this country, feeder cattle, come from small cow-calf operations, right? So there is value in taking these groups of calves from smaller operations, combining them, okay, increasing uniformity in a stocker operation before they go to a feedlot. Do feedlots feed very many 1 to 50 head pens? No. They're going to be 100 to 200 head pens, right? So there's value in increasing size of group size of similar uniformity. Okay? Won't touch on that stuff yet. Okay. So these are just 6 examples of very important stocker regions in the U.S. We'll go into much greater detail on these later. Okay. We have winter wheat grazing in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas. We'll go into a lot more detail on why that system developed in those 3 states, why it's not very prevalent in other regions, why it's not very prevalent as you get farther south or north, right? Okay, about 1.2 million head of cattle get grazed on winter annuals in Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma each year. Okay, big operation, very economically important. Okay, summer grazing in the Flint Hills of Kansas. Okay, this would be the Osage County area of Oklahoma as well. Tallgrass prairie. Who's ever seen, what is that movie? The Flower of the, oh, what is it? Killers of the Flower Moon. That is set in Osage County, Oklahoma. Right? Okay. So that area of northeast Oklahoma, southeast Kansas, up through south, just south of Manhattan, Kansas, is very important region for stocker operations. They have very seasonal grazing. They'll bring them in, graze them for 150 days, then sell them, and then they won't have any cattle on them. Typically, there's some cow-calf operations and other things, but then they won't have any cattle on them until that next spring. Okay, and we'll talk about that in much greater detail too. Okay, we have some summer grazing in the high plains, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado. So as you go farther west, we start getting into more short grass prairie species because they have less rainfall, right? Okay, tall grass prairie species like in the Flint Hills of Kansas require more rainfall. Okay. Fall crop residue grazing. So these could be corn and sorghum stubble fields in Nebraska, some in Kansas. Cool season-based winter grazing in the southeast and delta states, predominantly going to be based on annual ryegrass. Okay, those annual ryegrass will be typically sowed in October, start grazing in late November, early December, and then they'll stop. They'll be played out in like May. Okay, and then backgrounding programs. So they're kind of scattered across the U.S. Here I say Appalachian, Corn Belt, and Northern Plains, but there's a decent amount of backgrounding operations here in the Southern Plains as well. My buddy consults for a few in Southwest Oklahoma, where they're putting up wheatlage and then feeding steam flaked wheat, okay, that they grow on site. Okay. All right, production role of the stocker industry. So the focus is on animal growth, okay? We want to add frame and muscle to these animals prior to them going to a feedlot and receiving a high finishing diet, okay? What would happen if we took a weaned calf, put it in feedlot, and then started giving it a finisher diet? Yeah, absolutely. You'd have a lot of animals that are yield grades 4s and 5s at acceptable harvest weights, right? What would happen if we had an animal that had too much frame when they were placed into a feedlot? Yeah, that's true. They may have excessive carcass weights by the time they reach acceptable quality grades, right? That's not as big of a deal today, but it was in the past. Okay. All right. So the production role of the stocker industry, they're typically going to be based on forage programs. Even backgrounding yards are going to be forage based, right? They're going to have a higher forage diet being fed to these cattle in confinement, lower concentrate. Okay. So stocker operations, so pasture-based operations, are typically going to be based on low input and low costs. Okay, so they're trying to put a reasonable amount of average daily gain on these animals at as cheaply as possible. Okay, any questions? All right, and obviously they should be recognized as a viable economic enterprise. Okay, these producers still need to make money. Even if they own the land and they aren't necessarily paying pasture rent costs, right? They still need to turn a profit. Okay, production role of stocker cattle kind of continuing. So we need to increase feeder cattle weight, age, and uniformity. So we need to upgrade cattle quality. Okay. Um, so we want to increase carcass weights at acceptable quality grades. Okay, just like we'd said, if we took that weaned calf, put them directly on a high finishing diet, high energy finishing diet, they would be very light at acceptable quality grades. Okay, they would have also low yield grades. Okay, and then is there a potential to buy a medium frame steer, muscle score 2, and upgrade those cattle into a large frame steer, muscle grade 1s? We'll look at a paper that showed that is very possible, where you can buy cheaper cattle and then upgrade their quality by adding frame size and muscling. Okay. Okay. Role of the stocker backgrounder industry relative to the need to grow cattle. Okay, there are some calves that could be weaned at acceptable weights to where they could be placed directly into a feedlot, right? We looked at the closeouts of Kansas State Focus on Feedlot report. Placement weight average 750 pounds. So we're going to wean some calves that are already have enough frame and enough body weight that they don't really need a growing phase. They could be placed directly into a feedlot, fed a backgrounding diet, receiving diet for a little short period of time, and then transition to a finisher. Mm-hmm. What is the average weaning weight? Best guess. Yep. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 550, 600 pounds ish. Yep. Um, So most calves are not weaned at an acceptable weight to be placed directly into a feedlot. That is possible. Yep. So these, yep.
Standard set number, or is it more of an equation based off of frame size and like breed of cow?
Yep. Acceptable harvest weight, I guess what I'm meaning is the base price of premiums and discounts for small and large carcasses, somewhere around 600 to 900 pounds. And we'll look at some of this. So if you take 600 and 900 divided by 0.64, that'll tell you a range in live weight that is the base. So ideally, you want to be above that. The discount for lighter carcasses is much greater than the discount of heavy carcasses. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. So lower live weight calves, lighter muscled calves, low to moderate growth potential. They will typically enter a stalker backgrounder phase and then go from there to the feedlot, targeting that 600 to 900 pound carcass weight. Okay. Typically today, it's going to be greater than that. Okay. Cattle with greater live weight, moderate to heavy muscled, high gain potential are more likely to be placed directly into a feedlot and basically skip that growing phase. And so I say calves, and I'm using weaned calves as an example, but this could also include, yearlings that were overwintered on dormant range, right? This is just outside of the feedlot feeder supply. Okay. All right, consequences of not growing cattle prior to placement in the feedlot. Okay. Too fat at acceptable harvest weight. So we'll have a larger number of animals that are grading yield grade 4s and 5s. Okay. Or too light at acceptable quality grades. Right? We need to add frame to cattle, increase muscling so that we can have acceptable live weights at harvest at acceptable quality grades. Okay. Consequences of getting cattle too big or heavy prior to being placed in a feedlot. All right. We have too heavy carcasses and discounts for heavy carcasses. So heavy carcasses receive a discount. Some packers, it's kind of rare today, but some packers will actually refuse to slaughter cattle that are too heavy. Okay. 5 years ago, we had a couple that the packer turned away that was like 1550. Okay. I doubt they would do that today. But problems with having cattle that are too heavy on the rail. Meat guy. Any thoughts? Dragging the floor, breaking the rail. Does everybody know what I'm talking about by the rail? Okay. So in a packing plant, they take them to the knock box. They, what's it called? Stun them. Then they hang them by their, what's it called? Hocks. And then they are on a rail. And so this rail literally has a hook that they're hooked on and wheels that will hang the animal upside down, and you can push them through the way, and they'll actually be on a chain that'll drag that carcass through the packing plant as it goes through the different stages of processing. Okay. And then eventually you get to where the carcass is dehydrated, all the viscera is taken out, and they're split in half. So deheaded, then split in half, and then you'll have two halves of a carcass that are on the rail. So if an animal is too big, they could be dragging the floor as they're going through the packing plant, which for obvious reasons, meat safety is kind of a no-no. Also, if they're too big, you could have, and this has happened in some packing plants, the weight is too much for the rail to support, and it will actually break. So you can have substantial downtime where they have to repair that stuff, and that costs the packing plant a lot of money, right? So we have had at Bushland some cattle turned away. We've also had some, like where we sent a group and they're real heavy, like 1650. They said, don't do this again, but they took them, right? Um, okay. Today, where we have a low feeder supply and these packers are really trying to incentivize maximizing the amount of beef output per animal, the discounts on heavy carcasses is not very great. Okay. So, for example, a 1,050 pound or over carcass weight only receives a discount of $16.67 per hundredweight. Okay. So that's not that great if we think that the base price for a carcass animal is going to, or for a fed animal on a carcass basis is going to be somewhere around $350 per hundredweight. Okay. Okay. And then increased feeding costs. So it takes longer for them to be on feed to reach that acceptable quality grade, which was the point that you made. What's your name? What's your name? Connor. Okay. I'll probably ask that again. Actually, I don't remember anyone's name. So I may need to start having you tell me your names as you answer questions. Okay. All right. So we looked at some of this. This is just another repository of data that you can look at. So this is the 5-area weekly weighted average direct slaughter cattle premiums and discounts from Monday, 2026. So that would be this Monday. Okay. So here's the average premium for prime, average discount for standard, average discount for select. Choice is 0 because that's your base. Premium for yield grade 1s. Okay. Premium for yield grade 2s. Discount, they're not even receiving a discount if they are 3.5 to 4. But here's they start receiving a discount from 4s and 5s. So $9 for 4.25, and then $13 per hundredweight for 5, yield grade score of 5. Okay, so here are the discounts for light carcasses. So 450-pound carcass weight. You can divide all these by 0.64-ish, and that'll give you live weight. And you can see that the discounts for light cattle are much higher than the discounts for heavier cattle. The premiums for primes is much higher than the discounts for yield grades 4s and 5s. So we've already talked about this. Heavy incentive, feed cattle longer, feed cattle heavier, so that we can maximize beef production per animal because we have that low feeder supply. So you can look at the feeder supply change over time. It's been decreasing following the cow-calf herd that we've seen several graphs of, but beef production in the U.S. has stayed relatively stable. That's because we're finishing these animals to heavier endpoints. Okay, any questions? Okay, so I didn't update this with the most recent numbers, so this would have been from the report we looked at last year. But we went over how to calculate the grid. So yield grade 3 is your base, choice is your base. Those are the premiums and discounts in blue. And then you can calculate what premium a yield grade 1 would get, for example. Okay, and then this shows your discounts. Again, even last year, they were discounting much greater for light carcasses relative to heavy carcasses. And so 600 to 900-pound carcasses is the base price. Okay. Any questions? I think I made those points. So we'll move on. Okay. So frame size. Okay. There are USDA AMS standards for what they constitute small, medium, and large frame steers, and then muscle scores 1 through 4. Okay. For frame size, it's based off of final body weight at 28% empty body fat or grading quality grade choice. Okay. For steers, a large frame steer will be over 1,250 pounds at a quality grade of choice. Okay. A small frame steer will be under 1,100 pounds at a quality grade choice. Do we think we have very many steers that are fed that this aligns with? No. They need to probably update these because we have much larger animals and we're feeding them for much longer. Okay. Heifers, similar thing, but everything's just a little lighter. So a large frame heifer will finish at quality grade choice at 1150. Okay. A small frame heifer will finish choice at less than 1,000 pounds. So not very relevant to today's industry. But these are the standards. So when you see a medium and large frame animal in those auction market reports, this is what those are based off of. Okay. Why would steers have lower thresholds than, or heifers have lower thresholds than steers? What's your name? Sarah? Do you have a guess why heifers would have a lower threshold of body weight to grade choice than steers? Uh, Flip that. Heifers have, at the same body weight, they are at a more advanced physiological stage of maturity and will have more fat than steers. But absolutely, it's all about carcass fatness at a given body weight. Okay. Any questions? All righty. So this is, I don't even remember what study this is from, but they looked at small, medium, and large frame steers. There you can see the initial body weight, 650, 700, 770, or 880 pounds. Then there's the final body weight. So a small frame steer was finished at 1,000 pounds, medium frame steer just under 1,200, large frame steer 1,300 pounds. Okay, so this is their carcass weight, 621, 739, 817. You could literally take 621, divide it by 1,016, and that'll tell you dressing percent. Okay, we've talked about dressing percent. You will have to use it in your test to go from live base price to carcass base price. Okay. So what is 621 divided by 1,000 or 1,016? 61%. So that small frame group of steers had a 61% dressing percentage. So what is 817 divided by 1313? 62. So typically, as you feed cattle to heavier weights, they will have a higher dressing percentage. It's usually much more drastic than that. Okay. Fat thickness. So this is back fat thickness. These are all at a half inch of back fat thickness. So that's kind of a common, cattle buyers will use that half inch back fat thickness as an indication that they'll grade choice. So it's kind of commonly used as a visual appraisal of cattle to where you can say this is a good endpoint. We're feeding cattle well beyond that. Okay. Ribeye area, so this is in inches squared, 12, 13.8, 14. And then quality grade, 6.1, 5.8, 5.6. Little key here, a 5 is low choice, a 6 is average choice. So these small frame cattle were finished at 1,000 pounds of body weight at average choice quality grade. These large frame cattle were finished at 1,300 pounds at an average quality grade between average choice and low choice. Okay, so this group probably could have been fed a little longer to achieve a similar quality grade as the small frame steers. So those numbers would be shifted a little longer or a little more drastic. Does that make sense? Okay. But this does kind of paint the picture in a decent way of what we're talking about with frame size. Okay. This is a visual. Okay. Which one's the small frame steer? Not a trick question. This one, okay. Large frame. This one, medium frame. Middle, okay. What else can you think when you see this picture? Yeah, yeah. They're also all fed in the same pen, right? So chances are they're going to be shipped to the packing plant at the same time. So do we think that if we fed the animals to where the pen was, best guess, an average choice quality grade, do you think this guy would be choice? No, he's probably going to be leaner, probably would require more days on feed compared to this guy. He's probably going to be a little too fat if we're feeding to the average pen, right? That's an important reason why increasing uniformity, that's why it's important to increase uniformity in feedlot pens so that whenever you harvest them based on the average estimated quality grade of that cattle, the standard deviation or the range of that pen is not as great. Okay? So you'll have some feedlots that will do a terminal sort. So they'll sort at arrival based off of frame size, visuals, usually just body weight. Okay? And then at reimplant, which we'll talk about later, but it's just another opportunity where they go through the chute, they may do a terminal sort. Okay? And then again, try to group them up by likes so that the range in quality grade within a pen is less. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. Small, guys in the middle, maybe a medium, but could be a small there on the right. And then this large one is on the left. So same story though. These guys are all being fed in the same pen, right? Okay. Large, guy on the left. Small, obviously the one in the middle. Medium or small frame on the right. Okay. So this frame size is assigned to those animals just based off of visual appraisal. So there are some indications that they can use to assign that because frame size is obviously going to be dependent on age as well, right? You may have a small framed animal that's 12 months of age that could have the same hip height as a large frame animal at 6 months of age. Does that make sense? So frame size is a function of frame size, but also age. Okay. So some indications that they can use for age is the length of the tail relative to the rest of the body. Okay. Coarseness of the hair in the switch. So does anyone know what the switch is? That long hair that's at the end of the tail. Okay. This part, right? So that long part at the end of the tail is called the switch. Width of the muzzle relative to the rest of the body size. Coarseness of the hair on the poll. So the poll of an animal is their forehead. Okay. Size of the feet, ears, base of the horns. So all these things they can use and make a judgment based off how big that animal is, how large that animal is relative to these indicators to make a guess on maturity or age of that animal. Okay, any questions? Okay, muscle score. Okay, why do we care about muscle score? Well, it's related to muscle to bone ratio, so it's technically independent of frame size, but it would indicate how muscular that animal is right? Okay. So at a given degree of fatness, muscle score should indicate potential to have higher yield grades. So the lower the muscle score value, which is better, muscle score ones are better than muscle score fours, okay? That a one would have a better likelihood of getting a yield grade of one than a muscle score two. That make sense? Okay. So thicker muscled animals will have more lean meat. So it's an indication of cutability or potential to have a adequate yield grade. Any questions? Okay. So, all right, muscle thickness score ranges 1 to 4. So we have moderately thick, whatever that means, tends to be slightly thick, whatever that means, thin, okay, and then a big long definition of muscle score 4, which is basically saying below the minimum threshold to be scored a 3, okay? So these are all very subjective scores, okay? This is a diagram literally taken out from that USDA AMS standards for frame and muscle scoring, okay? This will be an example of a muscle score 1, muscle score 2, 3, and 4, okay? So we're pretty much just looking at the musculature of these hind legs as an indication of musculature of the whole animal. Does that make sense? Okay. Another little diagram out of that publication, muscle score 1, 2, 3, and 4. Most beef breeds will be muscle scores 1s and 2s. Where you start getting to 3s and 4s, you're getting more into dairy breeds. Any questions? What's that? Oh, yeah. Okay. So this is going to be a little more challenging to say, but which of these cattle do you think has the highest muscle score? Far right, kind of taken at an angle. I would also say maybe the middle. Okay. What would we think a muscle score for this guy would be? 3, maybe 2, but 3 is probably not a bad guess. Okay. All right. So is there a potential to buy cattle that are medium frame muscle score 2s and upgrade them to large frame muscle score 1s? Okay. So Ryan Reuter, he's actually my master's advisor. He's at Oklahoma State now, but he did this study when he's with the Noble Research Institute in Ardmore, Oklahoma. So 30 minutes north of Dallas. Okay. He bought cattle that were small, medium, large frame, muscle scores 1s and 2s, and he did this over 3 years, and he bought 180 head of cattle per year. Okay. So after they were purchased, small, medium, and large frame, muscle scores 1s and 2s, they underwent a stalker phase, and they followed them through finish. Okay. They recorded auction bid price. So what did they pay at the auction market prior to the stalker phase? And then they calculated net returns after the stalker, finisher, and then cumulative net return for stalker and finisher. Okay. Any questions with this experimental design? Okay. All right. I was kind. I took all the data from the tables and converted them from kilograms to pounds. Okay. All right. So this is just looking at small, medium, and large frame steers. Okay. Purchase body weight. There were no difference in initial body weight based off frame size. So the small frame steers were probably a little older, because we would expect at the same age, large frame would weigh more than small frame. Does that make sense? Okay. Graduate students, whenever I say linear and quadratic here, what am I talking about? Okay, so, okay, these are polynomial orthogonal contrasts, okay? So we look at the ANOVA p-value of across these three different treatments, and then we need to, ANOVA tells you that one or more treatment are different. It doesn't tell you which ones are different, okay? When you have experiments that you have this kind of continuation in a gradient, you will often do mean separation to tell which treatments are different based off of the shape of that. So this linear trend, a significant linear trend, would say it's either increasing or decreasing in a linear trend, okay? The quadratic would indicate it's shaped like a quadratic, like a little smiley face, right? So it could be no change from small to medium and then increase at large. Could be no change from small to medium, decrease. It could be low at small, high at medium, low at large. Does that make sense? But the graph is just shaped like a quadratic. Everybody make sense? Okay. So purchase price, and look at these prices, my God. Small, they got a discount, got them for $92 a hundredweight. That's way different than what we're seeing today, right? These animals would be in the fours probably. Okay. Medium, $103 a hundredweight. Large, $105 a hundredweight. And so they reported a quadratic trend. So small was lowest, and then it increased for medium and large, right? Okay. Grazing performance. So this is body weight at turnout. Large at turnout for the grazing part, the stalker part. Okay. So this would be after a short receiving period, probably a 56-day receiving period to just kind of straighten them out. Okay. This is where we start seeing the body weight begin to differ. So small had the lowest body weight, large had the highest body weight, and that's significant linear trend, p-value of 0.04. Okay. So what does a p-value tell us, graduate students? In terms of P stands for what? The abbreviation of P. Probability. Okay, so we are 96% certain that this difference isn't due to just random chance. Okay. Okay, final body weight after the grazing period, linear increase from small, medium to large, average daily gain, large steers gain more. So bid price, this would be what they would have brought if they sold them right after the stalker period. Okay, so you can see that smalls would have received a discount really relative to large frame steers. Well, no. Does that make any sense? I would say I would actually look at those numbers and say there's not much difference in bid price following the grazing period, even if that p-value is significant. Okay. Net returns, they actually had a lower net return per head during the stalker period from large frame cattle. That's surprising. Those cattle performed the best, but they had the highest purchase price, purchase cost. Okay. So small frame cattle actually made them more money than those large frame cattle. And it's because you didn't really receive hardly any or at all discount for the bid price following grazing. Okay. Then they followed them through finish. Small frame, it was the lightest, medium frame, intermediate. Large frame was the highest, and that was in a linear increasing kind of trend. At finish, you kind of saw where small frame started low, and then it kind of increased for medium, and then maybe more plateaued for the large frame cattle. So that was their final body weight after the finishing period. Small frame cattle in the feed yard and medium frame cattle in the feed yard actually gained more, had a greater average daily gain than those large frame cattle in the feed yard. A bit surprising. So these are their yield grades. No difference really. Marbling score. These cattle had the highest marbling score. These cattle had the lowest marbling score. So they probably should have fed the large frame cattle for longer to achieve the same quality grades. Does that make sense? Carcass price. So this is what they would have received following the end of finishing. So 117, 116, $114 per hundredweight carcass, dress basis. Again, very, very low relative to what we're seeing today. These would be like 350 a hundredweight. Okay. So net return, small and medium actually made more money. They made $23 per head over that finishing period. Large frames lost 50 cents, okay, per head. Cumulative net return, so this is profit from stocker and the finisher. So $136 per head for small, $108 per head for medium, then $77 per head for the large. Okay. So very important caveat here, and the biggest weakness of this experiment. If they would have fed those large frame steers to a further endpoint to where they had a common quality grade, this would look probably way different. Okay. And probably be more in line of what I would say our typical classic understanding of small, medium, and large frame cattle would be. Does that make sense? Any questions with this? How are we doing on time? 20 minutes. What you got?
So you're saying that they
Yeah. Yep. So if they would have fed these cattle, the large frame cattle, to a common carcass endpoint, so a common quality grade, they would obviously have heavier body weights, which they didn't see. Well, they did, but this would be much higher than this. Yeah. And then this net profit would probably at least be more similar because this carcass price would probably be higher. Any questions? Okay. All right. So this is just the data for muscle scores 1s and 2s. So there's no real difference between muscle score 1s and 2s in the grazing performance or really in the finishing performance, except for yield grade. And this is actually opposite. Oh, no, it would be kind of exactly what you would expect. Muscle score 1s had a lower yield grade than muscle score 2s, so lower is better, right? Muscle score 1s. Okay, ultimately, there was no difference in net returns from these two groups of steers. Also, the purchase price was not very discounted for a muscle score 1s and 2s. So a lot of these differences in net price that we're seeing, or net returns that we're seeing, is going to be driven by that bid price, that initial purchase price of these cattle. So in that previous table where we saw smalls and mediums actually made more than large, it's largely driven because they got a discount on that group of cattle relative to the large frame. Any questions? Okay, here's where we're going to get into kind of the importance of this and relative to upgrading cattle. All right, so they investigated the percent of cattle that were graded as small, medium, and large, and muscle score 1s and 2s at initial purchase, and relative to what they would have been graded at harvest, at finish. Okay. So based off the carcass results, they reclassified those animals as 1s and 2s or small, medium, and large. Okay. So any increase in grade/score would indicate an upgrading of those cattle. So did you have animals that were initially classified as a medium that were reclassified as a large, or small to medium, or twos to ones? Does that make sense? Okay. So 38%, only 38% of medium frame steers were graded correctly. So 62% were incorrectly graded at initial purchase relative to how they finished. Okay. 66% of large frame steers were graded correctly. So that meant that you still had 34% of cattle that were classified as large that actually went down to mediums. Okay. 53% of muscle score ones were graded correctly. So you had 47% that were graded as muscle score ones that really should have been muscle score twos. Okay. And then 63% of muscle score twos were graded correctly. So that would be 37% of muscle score twos should have actually been muscle score ones. Okay. Okay, key takeaway. It's difficult to estimate slaughter weights and ribeye area, so cutability, many months prior to harvest. So growing programs that can upgrade cattle can allow you to purchase cheaper cattle, so lower frame score and lower muscle scores, upgrade them, and make you profitable over time. Does that make sense? Okay. So 47% of cattle did go down a muscle score grade, so from ones to twos at harvest. This is likely related to physiological maturity and fat thickness of those cattle. Maybe not necessarily related to ribeye area or their actual musculature, but they were just fatter, and so that yield grade calculation also gets discounted based off fatness, right? Any questions? Okay, that was all the production role of the stalker industry. Now we're going to talk about the inventory role of stalkers. Okay, in general, stalker operations, since there's such a wide variety of systems, times when cattle are bought and then sold, length of time that cattle are grazed, they play an important inventory role. If we remember, most cattle are born in the spring, February through April, okay? So most cattle are weaned in the fall. So if we didn't have stalker operations to spread that influx of cattle, we would have a very seasonal beef production, okay? But because we have cattle that can go into a stalker operation and be grazed for varying lengths, it spreads that inventory out across the year more evenly. Because as a beef industry, we don't want to produce all of our meat in the spring, right? We want our meat to be a continuous supply where we have fresh meat for our consumers to eat spread throughout the year. Okay? So they allocate feeder supplies over time, seasonally, and then year to year. You have some cattle that could be purchased in the spring. What am I trying to say? They could be purchased in the fall, overwintered on dormant grass, and then grazed in the summer, and that would shift that inventory of feeder cattle from one year to the next. Does that make sense? Okay. So we have this results in a variation in slaughter cattle age. Okay. Calf feds will be harvested at a younger physiological maturity, younger chronological age than short yearlings, which would typically be harvested at 10 to 14 months, or long yearlings, which would be typically harvested at 15 to 20 months of age. Okay? So the inventory role of the stalker cattle system and backgrounder is that it spreads cattle inventory more evenly distributed across the year, seasonally and year to year. So it helps us produce beef more evenly throughout the year. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is especially true for grazing winter annuals, where we can purchase weaned calves in the fall when most of them in the U.S., it's like 56% of calves would be weaned in the fall. So it allows us to purchase cattle in the fall, graze them over winter, and then sell them in the spring when there's a seasonal low in feeder cattle inventory. Okay. So it allows us to shift the supply of cattle that are available for feed yards to place into their feed yard from periods with large supply of animals to periods with low supply of animals. Any questions? Okay. Third role, market balancing. Okay. It helps us maintain an economic balance between livestock, this includes other livestock species, grain, and forage markets. So, as a quote, remember this, the stocker industry is the shock absorber of the beef industry. The stocker sector is the shock absorber of the beef industry. Okay. So it allows the industry to make quick changes in production systems based off of perturbations to external factors like grain prices go up overnight. Stocker and backgrounders provide an opportunity to take those cattle inventory away from the feedlot, put weight on them to where they're fed corn in the feedlot for a shorter period of time to help offset that extra cost to those feed yards. Does that make sense? Okay, and we'll look at some of that. Okay, shock absorber. So here we have the CPI adjusted cost of gain, so inflation adjusted cost of gain for feed yards. Reds are heifers, blues are steers, and this is from basically 1995 to 2024. Okay, what do you notice? Just about this graph. Goes from really low to very high. Okay. Here we have inflation adjusted corn price in dollars per bushel. Goes from pretty low to very high. If we were to lay those two graphs over each other, what would you notice? They're about the same. Changing in corn prices drive these increased spikes in feedlot cost of gain. Okay? So, move this thing. All right. So, why did we see those spikes in corn prices? Okay. Here we have one somewhere around 2005, 6, 7, 8. 2008 saw a huge spike in corn price relative to the growth in ethanol production. So that's called a supply market. Ethanol took corn that would have traditionally gone to feeding cattle out of cattle production and into ethanol production. So supply demand increases price. Okay. Here, 2010 through basically 11, 12, 2012, we saw another really big spike. Okay. So that was driven by a supply market, continued growth of the ethanol industry, and also a demand market, drought. We had a huge drought in the corn belt in areas that corn was predominantly produced, right? So we had a perturbation to supply and demand, so prices skyrocketed. Okay, we saw a similar response to cost of gain in the feedlot. Okay, here in 2021, 22, saw another spike in corn prices. Okay, mainly related to input costs, COVID, demand increases. We started sending a lot to China. Drought, so supply, and then the war in Ukraine, so global supply, right? The Ukraine, probably shouldn't say the Ukraine. I think that's kind of communist maybe. Ukraine is they call it the breadbasket of Europe, right? So it's a big grain producing country. What's that? Oh, I thought you said something. Sorry. Okay, so what did I do? I took Oklahoma City National Stockyard prices for systems relative to or relevant to summer intensive early stocking. We'll talk about that. Summer season long stocking. We'll talk about that later. Winter wheat with a graze out, and then winter wheat without a graze out. So the bid price I pulled from those auction market reports were the same for the summer systems, and they were the same for the winter systems, the winter wheat systems, independent on graze out or not. Okay. The sell price that I pulled from the auction market reports were different for intensive early stocking, season long stocking, graze out, and non-graze out. Basically, these are systems that exist within forage type systems that change when cattle are sold. So how long are they grazed? We'll talk about that in greater detail. Don't worry about it too much. So with that bid price or that initial purchase price I took from the auction market and that sell price, I assigned relevant purchase and sell weights, and I calculated the value of gain of these systems for each year, and that's on our y-axis. Then I took the average feedlot cost of gain during that same year, okay, from the Kansas State Focus on Feedlot report. Okay, so what do you see? At low feedlot cost of gain, we have low value of gain in the stocker industry. Okay, when cost of gain in the feedlot is low, there's less incentive for them to allow stocker feeder cattle to go to grazing systems. They have more incentive to get cattle at lighter weights and put body weight on those animals in the feedlot. Okay? As cost of gain increases, especially at $100 per hundredweight, we see the value of gain in stocker systems skyrocket. Okay? So this graph is from the last 5 years, 2020 to 2024. Okay? This $100 feedlot cost of gain, which was really the breaking point where we see value gain in the stocker operation increase, happened at a cost of gain somewhere around $6 per bushel for corn price. Okay, and that's based off of that regression we looked at in last lecture. Okay, any questions on this? Key takeaway: stocker value of gain is positively related to feedlot cost of gain. If I ask you to describe the relationship, you would say they're positive. One increases, the other increases. Okay? Maybe I ask you to expand on that. What would we say? We incentivize stocker operators to put weight on cattle when it costs a lot of money to do it in a feedlot. Does that make sense? Is that pretty obvious? I think so. I was pretty tickled when I saw this actual relationship by pulling together these multiple data sources. Okay? So this is the same approach, but from 1997 to 2024. Okay? One thing I'll point out on this slide, over the last 5 years, our R squared was 0.86. So 86% of the variation in stocker value of gain was explained by feedlot cost of gain. Okay? If I include the data from 1997 to 2024, that R squared goes down to 47. So there's more outliers, right? The relationship's not as clear. Okay? Okay. This is largely driven by 2 years. If I exclude 2012 and 2014 from this data set, the R squared jumps up 0.21. So it explains additional 21% of the variation. Okay? And this all just has to do with market timing relative to historic feeder prices. Got 5 minutes. Okay? So what happened in 2012, 2014? 2012, we go from this to this. Okay. So actually, if I bought cattle in 2012, they would have been purchased in 2011. So we would have bought them here when prices were relatively low. Then almost overnight, they jump up really high. And so we got an outlier for that year because we purchased cattle at a discount and we sold them at an excessive premium. Okay. 2014 was the opposite. We bought cattle around here and then would have sold them at a discount. Bought them at a premium, sold them at a discount. So it created these huge outliers in the data set. Okay. Key takeaways from this lecture: 3 economic roles of the stocker industry. Understand why we care about frame size, why we care about muscle score, know the consequence of not having a growing system to cattle, whether that's in a pasture or in confinement, and understand the relationship between feedlot cost of gain and stocker value of gain and how that relates to the market balancing role of the stocker industry. Okay, any questions? Let's get out of here.